What happens when the very symbol of safety becomes the face of terror? When the man patrolling your neighborhood, wearing a badge and a promise to protect, is hiding the darkest parts of the human mind beneath his uniform. Mikhail Popkov was not just another officer in the Russian city of Angarsk. Behind the controlled posture and familiar smile was a predator who claimed the lives of at least 83 women, and likely many more. His victims, often lured by the illusion of protection, were brutally murdered in acts that suggested not chaos, but intention, not impulse, but judgment. How does someone tasked with upholding the law become the architect of such methodical violence? What fractures, what silent storms must exist in a mind like his? Have you ever wondered what truly drives a mind like this? Stay with me. The truths we are about to uncover go deeper than you might expect. If you value deep psychological exploration over easy answers, a like will help us continue unveiling the unseen layers of the human mind. And while you're here, check if you're already subscribed to Criminal Psychology Unmasked. This space exists to analyze and question, never to excuse, never to glorify. To begin understanding this dual life of law and violence, of order and rage, we have to return to the very beginning, not the murders, not the trial, but the childhood that shaped it all. Mikhail Popkov's childhood did not begin with violence. It began with absence, not the absence of food or shelter, but of warmth, of safety, of connection. Born in 1964 in the Siberian city of Norilsk, and later raised in Angarsk, he grew up in a Soviet household ruled by strict roles, where personal expression was a luxury and obedience was survival. His father, reportedly an alcoholic, was emotionally distant and often unpredictable. His mother, though more present, was described as cold and harsh, a disciplinarian who valued silence over sentiment. Within this cold framework, Popkov was not nurtured. He was conditioned to suppress emotion, to fear vulnerability, and to equate order with punishment. The home was not a place to ask questions or seek comfort. It was a place to obey, to endure, and to disappear into the background. What begins as emotional neglect in such environments can grow into something far more complex, an identity built not around who one is, but around who one must pretend to be to survive. In early psychological development, particularly during the first years of attachment, a child learns their value through the emotional mirrors provided by caregivers. In Popkov's case, those mirrors reflected coldness, control, and a distorted sense of right and wrong. When a child is never allowed to feel safely held or emotionally seen, they often begin to split, not in the cinematic sense of multiple personalities, but in the more subtle psychological fracture between internal experience and external behavior. This internal division between what is felt and what is shown can, over time, create a person who is highly functional on the surface and profoundly detached underneath. In Popkov's case, this detachment would later become a survival mechanism, a mask that allowed him to simulate normality while something very different was growing inside. And yet, for all the repression, the house was not silent. It echoed with unspoken expectations, with the moral codes of the Soviet working class, with shame directed at deviation, especially toward anything seen as weak, disobedient, or morally loose. These early imprints, especially around gender and purity, appear later in his crimes like echoes, distorted but recognizable. His victims weren't random. Many of them were women he believed had violated a certain standard, women walking alone at night, suspected of drinking or promiscuity. It wasn't just murder, it was judgment. But long before the judgment came, the training, the indoctrination into silence, the belief that control is safety, that emotion is danger, the kind of environment that doesn't teach a child how to feel, only how to obey, how to hide, and how to punish what cannot be controlled. As we move into Popkov's adolescence, we'll begin to see how this emotional fracture evolved. Obedience no longer brought comfort. The mask began to crack, and beneath it a quiet storm was forming. Adolescence is often a period of tension between who we are told to be and who we start to feel we might become. For Mikhail Popkov, this stage of life did not bring clarity but confusion. In an environment where obedience was everything, he began to feel a subtle but growing dissonance between the version of himself he showed the world and the frustration taking root beneath the surface. His emotional isolation, once tolerated as a child, became harder to contain. But with no healthy model of communication, no emotional vocabulary, this frustration had nowhere to go. It didn't dissolve, it hardened. Popkov was not a violent teenager in the traditional sense. He didn't lash out publicly or draw attention. Instead, he became increasingly controlled, reserved, and inward-facing. Those who knew him described a quiet boy, polite, even helpful. But beneath that composure was something else, a growing rigidity, a need for rules, for structure, for certainty. These were not simply habits of discipline. They were symptoms of someone desperately trying to master his inner chaos by imposing external order. And when that order was challenged, whether by disrespect, disorder, or perceived weakness, it triggered not open confrontation, but internalized contempt. He began to develop a black and white worldview where things were either right or wrong, moral or immoral, pure or tainted. There was no room for ambiguity. And increasingly, the people who violated those unspoken rules, especially women who acted freely, who showed confidence or who rejected authority, began to symbolize threat. It's during adolescence that sexual identity, moral reasoning, and emotional regulation all begin to form. But for Popkov, these processes were not guided by open dialogue or emotional support. They were shaped in silence and shame. It's possible that early fantasies of domination or moral punishment began to take root here, not yet acted upon, but quietly rehearsed in thought. This is often how the darkest behavior begins, not with action, but with the repetition of a belief. Over time, those beliefs crystallize, especially when unchallenged. In a society like Soviet Russia, where conformity was culturally enforced and masculinity was defined by dominance and emotional control, Popkov found fertile ground for this psychological distortion. He could hide behind expected behavior while his inner world grew colder, sharper, more judgmental. By the end of his adolescence, Popkov was no longer just a boy who obeyed. He was a young man who judged, who believed that weakness deserved punishment. That disorder was a moral failure, and that control, total, uncompromising control, was the only way to restore balance. As we move forward into the next phase of his life, we will see how these silent convictions found their perfect disguise. In a uniform, the law would become his mask, and behind it, a new kind of power was born. When Mikhail Popkov joined the police force, it wasn't just a career move. It was the perfect disguise. The uniform gave him not only status and structure, but also legitimacy. It allowed him to continue masking what he had carefully rehearsed during adolescence: emotional detachment, a rigid moral code, and a deep contempt for anything he perceived as weak or corrupt. Now, with the law on his side, those beliefs no longer needed to stay hidden. They could be exercised under the pretense of authority. Wearing the uniform placed Popkov above suspicion. He wasn't just obeying the rules anymore, he was enforcing them. And in a society that revered discipline and feared disruption, his position as a law enforcement officer gave him something far more valuable than power: access. He had access to people's trust, to isolated areas, to victims who would not question his intentions until it was far too late. This is where the psychological fracture becomes operational. Popkov didn't see himself as a criminal. He saw himself as a guardian, one with a brutal, self-defined mission. Those he targeted were, in his mind, not innocent. They were violators of his personal code, women who drank, who walked alone at night, who didn't fit his moral ideal. His acts were not impulsive. They were judgments, executions of his own distorted sense of justice. What's chilling is how smoothly he integrated into normal life. He was a husband, a father, a respected officer. There were no glaring signs, no outbursts, no double life in the traditional sense. His life was the double, seamlessly blended. While other officers pursued suspects, Popkov joined them, calm and composed, even suggesting leads. His ability to manipulate perception was not theatrical, it was clinical. Psychologists often describe this kind of dissociation as a defense mechanism taken to its extreme. The ability to compartmentalize, to separate emotion from action, self from responsibility, can become dangerous when paired with power. In Popkov's case, that compartmentalization was sharpened by training, reinforced by uniform, and hidden in plain sight. His victims trusted the badge. He used it as bait. It's important to understand that Popkov wasn't killing to satisfy a compulsion in the way many serial killers do. His crimes were ritualistic, but not driven by frenzy. They were structured, methodical, and often included symbolic elements. The removal of clothing, the abandonment of bodies in isolated places, the return to crime scenes. These were not just signs of control. They were expressions of ideology. Twisted, yes, but deliberate. His killings weren't about lust, they were about purification, and all of it, the methods, the planning, the confidence, was made possible by the uniform. The very thing meant to represent protection became the vessel of violation. The law, in his hands, was no longer justice. It was a mask, a license, and the man behind it believed he was not breaking the order of things, but restoring it. In the next section, we'll begin to examine these crimes more closely, not through graphic detail, but through psychological pattern. Because each victim tells us something, not just about Popkov's methods, but about his mind. Mikhail Popkov's murders were not acts of chaos. They were not frenzied, impulsive bursts of violence. They followed a pattern, deliberate, structured, almost ritualistic in nature. Between 1992 and 2010, the bodies of women began to appear across forests and remote roadsides near the city of Angarsk. Many of the victims shared similar profiles, women walking alone at night, often after drinking, some leaving parties or bars. Some were sex workers. Others were simply vulnerable, alone, in the wrong place at the wrong time, crossing paths with the wrong man in uniform. Popkov's method was hauntingly consistent. He often offered rides in his police vehicle, a symbol of safety, and presented himself as an authority figure concerned with their well-being. Once isolated, the tone shifted. What followed was not simply murder, but punishment. Many victims were found with signs of extreme brutality, blunt force trauma, stabbing, even acts of post-mortem mutilation. But what stands out most is not just the violence itself, but the intention behind it. There was meaning in his mind, message. Popkov believed he was enacting justice, a moral enforcer punishing women who had, in his eyes, defied the code. He later described some victims as unclean, suggesting he viewed himself not as a killer, but as a purifier, removing what he saw as moral decay from society. This psychological framework is not uncommon among organized, mission-oriented killers. They do not kill for pleasure in the traditional sense. They kill with conviction, no matter how delusional or distorted. He wasn't choosing victims based on personal vendettas, but based on symbolic triggers. A woman walking home after drinking might remind him of moral failure. A confident posture, laughter, independence. These too were violations. What he could not control in himself, he sought to control in others. And when his judgment was passed, he executed it with calculated brutality. This belief system, however twisted, gave Popkov clarity. It allowed him to dehumanize his victims while preserving the illusion of purpose. In psychological terms, this is a defense mechanism of dissociation reinforced by narcissistic delusion. The belief that one is above the moral laws of others, acting on a higher code. He wasn't just hiding behind a mask. He believed in the mask. He believed in the righteousness of his violence. There are also indications of staging in some of the crime scenes, positioning of the bodies, returning to the sites, watching the investigations unfold. These are acts not just of control, but of psychological affirmation. Popkov needed to see that he remained invisible, that he was still trusted, that he was still winning, and for a long time he did. From his first confirmed murder in 1992 until his eventual arrest in 2012, Popkov operated in the shadows of his own community. He paused his killings for nearly a decade, from 2000 to 2010, likely due to increased surveillance or personal constraints. But when he returned, his method had not changed. The mission, in his mind, remained. Understanding these patterns forces us to confront uncomfortable questions, not just about Popkov, but about the systems, symbols, and beliefs that allowed him to hide in plain sight for so long. The badge, the uniform, the moral narrative. They did not just protect him, they empowered him. In the next section, we'll explore how the mask began to crack, how suspicion finally caught up with the man no one wanted to believe could be guilty, and how, even then, his psychological detachment remained disturbingly intact. For nearly 2 decades, Mikhail Popkov remained hidden, not by darkness, but by design. His crimes were committed in isolated areas, yes, but the real shield was his role. He wasn't lurking in shadows. He was sitting in squad cars, patrolling streets, smiling at neighbors. When bodies appeared, he was among the first to investigate. Sometimes he helped with search efforts. Sometimes he misled colleagues. His invisibility was not accidental. It was calculated, and it worked. But no mask holds forever. By the early 2010s, forensic technology had begun to evolve. A renewed effort to re-examine cold cases from the 1990s and early 2000s led investigators to revisit DNA samples collected from old crime scenes. In 2012, a mass DNA screening was quietly ordered among current and former law enforcement personnel in the region, a controversial but desperate step. Popkov, by then retired, voluntarily provided his sample. It matched. The arrest came swiftly and quietly. When confronted, Popkov didn't react with panic or denial. He was calm, measured. He confessed, not to 1 or 2 murders, but to dozens. Over time, that number would rise to 83 confirmed victims, with the possibility of many more. He spoke of them with detachment, rarely showing emotion. It wasn't pride, but it also wasn't remorse. This emotional flatness disturbed investigators and psychologists alike. Popkov didn't fit the stereotype of the frenzied, compulsive killer. He was rational, articulate, even helpful. He offered details, clarified timelines, walked them through his logic. He described his crimes not as acts of evil, but as necessary corrections, the fulfillment of a role he believed had been neglected by society. In his words, he had been cleansing his community. This type of cognitive distortion, where one sees themselves as the hero in a story of horror, is often present in highly organized offenders. But Popkov's case was especially unnerving because he showed no cracks in his narrative. He believed it, fully. To him, the uniform hadn't been a disguise. It had been a symbol of purpose. Even in court, he remained composed. His trial began in 2015, and although he received a life sentence, he would later confess to additional murders, pushing the boundaries of what investigators had imagined. What's most disturbing, perhaps, is how many people around him refused, or were unable, to see him clearly. His colleagues described him as competent. His wife spoke of him as loving. His daughter, in an interview years later, said she could not reconcile the man she knew with the monster portrayed in the news. This disconnect is more than emotional, it's psychological. It shows how convincingly someone can perform normality, even while harboring something entirely inhuman underneath. Popkov didn't break when he was caught. He didn't fall apart or express guilt. In some ways, the confession brought him relief. The mask had served its purpose. The mission in his mind was complete. What remained was acknowledgement, and so what began with silence ended in silence, but a different kind. Not the silence of shame or denial or fear, the silence of a man who had already decided long ago that the world was broken and that he was its answer. In the final section, we'll return to the root, to the psychology that shaped this man, to the disorders that may have gone undiagnosed, and to the uncomfortable question that lingers: what truly creates a killer like Popkov? Understanding Mikhail Popkov is not about excusing him. It's about looking into the void he carried, a void built not from madness, but from control, from a childhood where emotion was punished, where obedience was survival, where punishment became a language of power long before it became a tool of violence. Popkov was not born a killer. He was shaped, piece by piece, silence by silence, until the man and the mask became indistinguishable. Psychologists have pointed to signs of antisocial personality disorder, traits of narcissism, and a complete lack of empathy. But diagnosis alone cannot explain what he became. The question is not only what disorder he may have had, but how that disorder was nurtured, not treated, not interrupted, not recognized, until it metastasized into ideology. His sense of morality was rigid, binary. You were clean or you were dirty. You were obedient or you were chaos. And in his eyes, chaos had to be punished, brutally, symbolically, and without remorse. The emotional foundation for this belief system was laid early, in his home, in his society, and within himself. What he couldn't express in words, he expressed in action. What he couldn't feel, he inflicted. This is what makes cases like Popkov's so haunting, because the danger isn't just in what he did, it's in how ordinary he appeared while doing it, how functional, how trusted, and how invisible the fracture remained, even as the bodies accumulated. Have you ever recognized fragments of these patterns in ordinary people? Share your perception. Your voice matters here. If you believe that questioning, not judging, is the path to understanding, consider subscribing to Criminal Psychology Unmasked. Here, we explore, not excuse, and don't stop here. In our next video, we'll examine another case, another mind shaped by pain, control, and silence. Because only by continuing to ask the right questions can we begin to see what hides behind the mask.